Book 1, Chapter 21 of Resurrection. When the examination of the articles of material evidence was finished, the President announced that the investigation was now concluded, and immediately called on the prosecutor to proceed, hoping that, as the latter was also a man, he too might feel inclined to smoke or dine, and show some mercy on the rest. But the public prosecutor showed mercy neither to himself nor to anyone else. He was very stupid by nature, but besides this he had had the misfortune of finishing school with a gold medal, and of receiving a reward for his essay on servitude when studying Roman law at the university, and was therefore self-confident and self-satisfied in the highest degree, his success with the ladies also conducing to this, and his stupidity had become extraordinary. When the word was given to him, he got up slowly, showing the whole of his graceful figure in his embroidered uniform. Putting his hand on the desk, he looked around the room, slightly bowing his head, and, avoiding the eyes of the prisoners, began to read the speech he had prepared while the reports were being read. "Gentlemen of the jury, the business that now lies before you is, if I may so express myself, very characteristic." The speech of a public prosecutor, according to his views, should always have a social importance, like the celebrated speeches made by the advocates who have become distinguished. True, the audience consisted of 3 women, a sempstress, a cook and simian sister, and a coachman, but this did not matter. The celebrities had begun in the same way. To be always at the height of his position, that is, to penetrate into the depths of the psychological significance of crime, and to discover the wounds of society, was one of the prosecutor's principles. "You see before you, gentlemen of the jury, a crime characteristic, if I may so express myself, of the end of our century, bearing, so to say, the specific features of that very painful phenomenon, the corruption to which those elements of our present-day society which are, so to say, particularly exposed to the burning rays of this process are subject." The public prosecutor spoke at great length, trying not to forget any of the notions he had formed in his mind, and on the other hand never to hesitate, and let his speech flow on for an hour and a quarter without a break. Only once he stopped, and for some time stood swallowing his saliva, but he soon mastered himself, and made up for the interruption by heightened eloquence. He spoke, now with a tender, insinuating accent, stepping from foot to foot and looking at the jury, now in quiet, business-like tones, glancing into his notebook, then with a loud, accusing voice, looking from the audience to the advocates. But he avoided looking at the prisoners, who were all 3 fixedly gazing at him. Every new craze then in vogue among his set was alluded to in his speech, everything that then was, and some things that still are, considered to be the last words of scientific wisdom, the laws of heredity and inborn criminality, evolution and the struggle for existence, hypnotism and hypnotic influence. According to his definition, the merchant Smelkoff was of the genuine Russian type, and had perished in consequence of his generous, trusting nature having fallen into the hands of deeply degraded individuals. Simeon Kartinkin was the atavistic production of serfdom, a stupefied, ignorant, unprincipled man, who had not even any religion. Euphemia was his mistress, and a victim of heredity. All the signs of degeneration were noticeable in her. The chief wire-puller in this affair was Maslova, presenting the phenomenon of decadence in its lowest form. "This woman," he said, looking at her, "has, as we have today heard from her mistress in this court, received an education. She cannot only read and write, but she knows French. She is illegitimate, and probably carries in her the germs of criminality. She was educated in an enlightened, noble family, and might have lived by honest work, but she deserts her benefactress, gives herself up to a life of shame in which she is distinguished from her companions by her education, and chiefly, gentlemen of the jury, as you have heard from her mistress, by her power of acting on the visitors by means of that mysterious capacity lately investigated by science, especially by the school of Charcot, known by the name of hypnotic influence. By these means she gets hold of this Russian, this kind-hearted Sadko being the hero of a legend, the rich guest, and uses his trust in order first to rob and then piteously to murder him." "Well, he's piling it on now, isn't he?" said the President with a smile, bending towards the serious member. "A fearful blockhead," said the serious member. Meanwhile, the public prosecutor went on with his speech. "Gentlemen of the jury," gracefully swaying his body, "the fate of society is to a certain extent in your power. Your verdict will influence it. Grasp the full meaning of this crime, the danger that awaits society from those whom I may perhaps be permitted to call pathological individuals, such as Maslova. Guard it from infection. Guard the innocent and strong elements of society from contagion, or even destruction." And, as if himself overcome by the significance of the expected verdict, the public prosecutor sank into his chair, highly delighted with his speech. The sense of the speech, when divested of all its flowers of rhetoric, was that Maslova, having gained the merchant's confidence, hypnotized him and went to his lodgings with his key, meaning to take all the money herself, but having been caught in the act by Simeon and Euphemia, had to share it with them. Then, in order to hide the traces of the crime, she had returned to the lodgings with the merchant, and there poisoned him. After the prosecutor had spoken, a middle-aged man in swallow-tail coat and low-cut waistcoat, showing a large half-circle of starched white shirt, rose from the advocate's bench and made a speech in defence of Kartinkin and Botchkova. This was an advocate engaged by them for 300 roubles. He acquitted them both, and put all the blame on Maslova. He denied the truth of Maslova's statements that Botchkova and Kartinkin were with her when she took the money, laying great stress on the point that her evidence could not be accepted, she being charged with poisoning. The 2,500 roubles, the advocate said, could have been easily earned by two honest people getting from 3 to 5 roubles per day in tips from the lodgers. The merchant's money was stolen by Maslova and given away, or even lost, as she was not in a normal state. The poisoning was committed by Maslova alone. Therefore he begged the jury to acquit Kartinkin and Botchkova of stealing the money, or if they could not acquit them of the theft, at least to admit that it was done without any participation in the poisoning. In conclusion, the advocate remarked with a thrust at the public prosecutor that the brilliant observations of that gentleman on heredity, while explaining scientific facts concerning heredity, were inapplicable in this case, as Botchkova was of unknown parentage. The public prosecutor put something down on paper with an angry look, and shrugged his shoulders in contemptuous surprise. Then Maslova's advocate rose, and, timidly and hesitatingly, began his speech in her defence. Without denying that she had taken part in the stealing of the money, he insisted on the fact that she had had no intention of poisoning Smelkoff, but had given him the powder only to make him fall asleep. He tried to go in for a little eloquence in giving a description of how Maslova was led into a life of debauchery by a man who had remained unpunished, while she had to bear all the weight of her fall. But this excursion into the domain of psychology was so unsuccessful that it made everybody feel uncomfortable. When he muttered something about men's cruelty and women's helplessness, the President tried to help him by asking him to keep closer to the facts of the case. When he had finished, the public prosecutor got up to reply. He defended his position against the first advocate, saying that even if Botchkova was of unknown parentage, the truth of the doctrine of heredity was thereby in no way invalidated, since the laws of heredity were so far proved by science that we can not only deduce the crime from heredity, but heredity from the crime. As to the statement made in defense of Maslova, that she was the victim of an imaginary, he laid a particularly venomous stress on the word imaginary, betrayer, he could only say that from the evidence before them, it was much more likely that she had played the part of temptress to many and many a victim who had fallen into her hands. Having said this, he sat down in triumph. Then the prisoners were offered permission to speak in their own defence. Euphemia Botchkova repeated once more that she knew nothing about it and had taken part in nothing, and firmly laid the whole blame on Maslova. Simeon Kartinkin only repeated several times, "It's your business, but I'm innocent. It's unjust." Maslova said nothing in her defence. Told she might do so by the President, she only lifted up her eyes to him, cast a look around the room like a hunted animal, and, dropping her head, began to cry, sobbing aloud. "What's the matter?" the merchant asked Nekhludoff, hearing him utter a strange sound. This was the sound of weeping, fiercely kept back. Nekhludoff had not yet understood the significance of his present position, and attributed the sobs he could hardly keep back, and the tears that filled his eyes, to the weakness of his nerves. He put on his pince-nez in order to hide the tears, then got out his handkerchief and began blowing his nose. Fear of the disgrace that would befall him if everyone in the court knew of his conduct stifled the inner working of his soul. This fear was, during this first period, stronger than all else. End of Book 1, Chapter 21. Book 1, Chapter 22, of Resurrection. After the last words of the prisoners had been heard, the form in which the questions were to be put to the jury was settled, which also took some time. At last the questions were formulated, and the President began the summing up. Before putting the case to the jury, he spoke to them for some time in a pleasant, homely manner, explaining that burglary was burglary, and theft was theft, and that stealing from a place which was under lock and key was stealing from a place under lock and key. While he was explaining this, he looked several times at Nekhludoff, as if wishing to impress upon him these important facts, in hopes that, having understood it, Nekhludoff would make his fellow jurymen also understand it. When he considered that the jury were sufficiently imbued with these facts, he proceeded to enunciate another truth, namely that a murder is an action which has the death of a human being as its consequence, and that poisoning could therefore also be termed murder. When, according to his opinion, this truth had also been received by the jury, he went on to explain that if theft and murder had been committed at the same time, the combination of the crimes was theft with murder. Although he was himself anxious to finish as soon as possible, although he knew that his Swiss friend would be waiting for him, he had grown so used to his occupation that, having begun to speak, he could not stop himself, and therefore he went on to impress on the jury with much detail that if they found the prisoners guilty, they would have the right to give a verdict of guilty, and if they found them not guilty, to give a verdict of not guilty, and if they found them guilty of one of the crimes and not of the other, they might give a verdict of guilty on the one count and of not guilty on the other. Then he explained that, though this right was given them, they should use it with reason. He was going to add that if they gave an affirmative answer to any question that was put to them, they would thereby affirm everything included in the question, so that if they did not wish to affirm the whole of the question, they should mention the part of the question they wished to be accepted. But, glancing at the clock, and seeing it was already 5 minutes to 3, he resolved to trust to their being intelligent enough to understand this without further comment. "The facts of this case are the following," began the President, and repeated all that had already been said several times by the advocates, the public prosecutor, and the witnesses. The President spoke, and the members on each side of him listened with deeply attentive expressions, but looked from time to time at the clock, for they considered the speech too long, though very good, that is, such as it ought to be. The public prosecutor, the lawyers, and, in fact, everyone in the court shared the same impression. The President finished the summing up. Then he found it necessary to tell the jury what they all knew, or might have found out by reading it up, that is, how they were to consider the case, count the votes, in case of a tie to acquit the prisoners, and so on. Everything seemed to have been told. But no, the President could not forgo his right of speaking as yet. It was so pleasant to hear the impressive tones of his own voice, and therefore he found it necessary to say a few words more about the importance of the rights given to the jury, how carefully they should use the rights, and how they ought not to abuse them, about their being on their oath, that they were the conscience of society, that the secrecy of the debating room should be considered sacred, etc. From the time the President commenced his speech, Maslova watched him without moving her eyes, as if afraid of losing a single word, so that Nekhludoff was not afraid of meeting her eyes, and kept looking at her all the time. And his mind passed through those phases in which a face, which we have not seen for many years, first strikes us with the outward changes brought about during the time of separation, and then gradually becomes more and more like its old self, when the changes made by time seem to disappear, and before our spiritual eyes rises only the principal expression of one exceptional, unique individuality. Yes, though dressed in a prison cloak, and in spite of the developed figure, the fullness of the bosom and lower part of the face, in spite of a few wrinkles on the forehead and temples, and the swollen eyes, this was certainly the same Katusha who on that Easter Eve had so innocently looked up to him whom she loved, with her fond, laughing eyes full of joy and life. What a strange coincidence that after 10 years, during which I never saw her, this case should have come up today when I am on the jury, and that it is in the prisoner's dock that I see her again. And how will it end? Oh dear, if they would only get on quicker. Still, he would not give in to the feelings of repentance which began to arise within him. He tried to consider it all as a coincidence, which would pass without infringing his manner of life. He felt himself in the position of a puppy, when its master, taking it by the scruff of its neck, rubs its nose in the mess it has made. The puppy whines, draws back, and wants to get away as far as possible from the effects of its misdeed, but the pitiless master does not let go. And so Nekhludoff, feeling all the repulsiveness of what he had done, felt also the powerful hand of the master, but he did not feel the whole significance of his action yet, and would not recognize the master's hand. He did not wish to believe that it was the effect of his deed that lay before him, but the pitiless hand of the master held him, and he felt he could not get away. He was still keeping up his courage, and sat on his chair in the first row in his usual self-possessed pose, one leg carelessly thrown over the other, and playing with his pince-nez. Yet all the while, in the depths of his soul, he felt the cruelty, cowardice, and baseness, not only of this particular action of his, but of his whole self-willed, depraved, cruel, idle life. and that dreadful veil which had in some unaccountable manner hidden from him this sin of his and the whole of his subsequent life was beginning to shake, and he caught glimpses of what was covered by that veil. End of Book 1, Chapter 22.